Hello everybody and welcome to the Hub, a series of webinars that's run by the AQR. I'm Ken Parker and for my sins I've been asked to host these sessions. Well, the way it works is we get really inspiring and inspirational speakers in who'll take you through their thoughts. If you've got any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Please type them up and they'll get addressed within the next day or two. So today I'm delighted to introduce Jim Mott of BAMM. Jim spoke at our recent AQR conference and was such a hit, we invited him back to expand on his thinking as to how understanding of people's stuff can be brought into the research process. So thank you very much, and I'm going to pass you over to Jim. Can you start?
Yeah, sure. Hello, thanks for logging on. So I'm going to be talking about stuff. And when I say stuff, I mean material objects, material things. And actually just that sort of whole notion of being materialistic, which has so many negative connotations in our culture. And I think that negativity has particular implications for us as researchers, because it's led to a bias where we tend to foreground the things that people say and do, and the way people interact with stuff, own it, collect it, consume it, and actually think through it and think with it isn't really understood because it's ignored and put in the background. So I think to ignore stuff is a particular cultural thing. So I'm going to explore that a little bit, and then I'm going to introduce some thinkers who actually put stuff into the foreground and how those ideas can be practically used in qualitative research. So,
right, thanks Jim, and I've now managed to get the slides where they should be, so apologies for that, and well done for ad-libbing throughout that, and well done for listening everybody. So please continue,
okay,
Jim.
Shall I jump in? Yeah. All right, okay. So that was actually my first slide. So my first point, I think, is that we have a difficult and quite contradictory relationship with stuff. So on the one hand, we've got a lot of it, probably more than we've ever done. So we obviously like it. But at the same time, we're told that liking it is bad. So we end up throwing a lot of it away. So you end up with things like 2.6 trillion tons of waste that we as a species produce every year, which seems a little bit excessive. And to me, I think this comes from the idea that what stuff does is that it somehow gets in the way of proper relationships. If we have an undue attachment to stuff, then we're misdirecting our attention and missing out on the really important relationships, which are the ones we have with other people and with our community. And that's actually a really old idea, because really what communities need is for stuff to circulate, to be exchanged, rather than to be hoarded by a few individuals. So what you get are lots of taboos and restrictions around the hoarding of stuff. And taboos usually work by invoking the divine in one way or another. So you kind of get this added moral layer on the top, which is over what is actually probably a pretty practical concern. So just to give you an example of what I mean here, this is a picture of a ceremonial armband or mwali, which is used in the Kula exchange, which takes place on the Trobriand Islands. If you've ever done any anthropology, this is Argonauts of the Western Pacific, which is Malinowski. But if you haven't, it's quite simple. Basically, the idea is that you go out in your canoe with your mwali to visit your trading partner, and you give it to him, and then he'll give you a necklace in return, which is a sort of ceremonial thing. And then once you've done that, the trade can begin. But the point is that both the armband and the necklace are pretty worthless on their own. They're just a sort of collection of shells and that sort of thing. But they have to remain in circulation to have any value. And if they're not in circulation, then trade can't take place. So they actually exist to maintain relationships. The very basic point I'm trying to make here is that holding on to stuff is bad. Circulating it is good. So that's kind of that practical concern sort of wrapped up in the ceremony that I mentioned. But that divine bit, that sort of taboo thing, I think is better illustrated when you look at monks, right? So these guys are like the sort of ultimate spiritual people in a way. And the way you know that is because one of the things that monks have to do to enter a monastery and become a monk is to renounce all ownership of possessions. And then once you're inside a monastery, what happens is that your relationship with stuff is regulated by these extremely complicated and fastidious rules. So like the precepts of St. Benedict and things like that, where they talk about sort of how you're supposed to gather windfall fruit from trees and you're not allowed to eat it, you have to pile it in a corner, that sort of thing. Because the idea being that stuff should only serve a very functional purpose of keeping the body alive whilst the mind busily obtains enlightenment. So where we are so far in my argument is basically that we know that stuff needs to be strictly regulated in the interests of the community, and that the material and the spiritual are almost sort of diametrically opposed. And I would kind of consider that to be the first sort of cultural thrust or underlying set of cultural ideas that inhibit our relationship to stuff. The other, I think, is a little bit more recent. So let me show you what I mean. So if you just have a look above this girl's armpit, you'll see that she has tattooed on her cogito ergo sum, which is obviously a massive benchmark actually in Western scientific thought, coined by Descartes in about 1637. And I chose this particular image because I think there's a nice poetry to it actually, because of the fact that it actually appears on a body. Because what cogito ergo sum really did was to desacralize the body. Before cogito ergo sum, the body was sacred. But by saying, I think, therefore I am, you're saying that my brain, my mind, has a higher function or a higher status in making me who I am than the body. So the mind is connected to the soul and to the divine, but the body becomes something mundane, which was great for medical science at the time because it meant that people could get on with dissecting corpses and all of those sorts of things without being burnt at the stake as heretics. And so after this is when medicine really took off. But from the point of view of this presentation, I guess what we're saying is that what happened was that the body got lumped in with the material world and made into something base, something separate and something not worthy of consideration compared to the mind. So now we've got the idea of the mind as being the repository of all human meaning, where all our knowledge and memories and all the things that make us human are stored. And this is how we got to people like Freud, who were able to then focus all of their attention onto what was going on inside people's heads. And hence you get the birth of psychoanalysis and psychology and Jung and the concepts of the unconscious mind and all of those great ideas that kind of come along with that. And I think that the psychoanalysis couch is kind of the model that has been adopted by the research industry, or certainly the qualitative arm of the research industry. It's this idea that we can sit people down and get them to talk, and by listening to what they have to say, we can get to the heart of the matter and understand why it is that people do what they do. And I guess that's kind of the thing I'd like to challenge here, which is the idea that the most important repository of meaning is inside the heads of the people we encounter through our research. And I don't think that's the only place we should be looking. So I'll give you like a really simple idea of what I mean, just to sort of start off with. And that's that we express ourselves and our unconscious ideas through our stuff. Let's go northern, mate. Sorry about that. So this here is a lottery ticket that was stuck on the fridge door of a lady we were visiting as part of a research project into finance. And I think if you look closely, you can see that she's actually won £3, which isn't particularly unusual, apart from the fact that this lady is actually a multi-millionaire and she has 3 million sitting in the bank. So it's kind of the question is, why does she have this lottery ticket stuck on her fridge? Why is it sort of there for future reference? She's clearly going to cash it in, but she clearly doesn't need it at the same time. And that's kind of a bit strange. But then stranger still was when we spoke to her, we found out that she hadn't actually told her family about the 3 million in the bank. Her kids didn't know, her friends didn't know, her husband sort of knew, but wasn't allowed to say anything. Because she kind of inherited this money, and she just didn't know what to do with it. So for her, wealth wasn't so much sort of liberating as it was absolutely terrifying. So what that lottery ticket actually represents is this desperate desire to retain some kind of facade of normality, because normal people will have a 3-quid lottery ticket and will cash it in, and so therefore so should she. So that's kind of what I mean by this idea of material stuff as expressions of the unconscious. This is a lottery ticket standing in for her unconscious desire to fit in as someone normal. But that's really not that interesting an idea. I think there's much more interesting things that come out than that. So I'm going to move on. If you look at this picture, this is a still from Blade Runner, right? It's one of my favourite films, and it's a film about unsettlingly blurry relationships between humans and machines. So the main hero, Deckard, is tasked with retiring androids who are attempting to pass as humans. And you're kind of not quite sure if maybe he's an android himself. And the question about where humanity ends and where machines begin is really problematized. That's kind of the underlying sort of questions that are going on with this film. And that came out in 1982. And in 1983, the Cyborg Manifesto was published. And the Cyborg Manifesto is an article that was written by Donna Haraway, who's kind of this radical feminist thinker. And just like Blade Runner, the Cyborg Manifesto also explores those unsettlingly blurry relationships between humans and machines. And what's particularly interesting in relation to what we've been talking about up to this point is that Haraway explicitly calls her manifesto a blasphemy against the old rigid distinctions between people and objects. And I say that's interesting because I think what we were talking about earlier was this sort of connection between the material world and spirituality. And she uses the word blasphemy very knowingly. She's aware of those distinctions as well. And she's very aware of that injunction against improper relationships with material things that are inherent in our cultural and spiritual traditions. And she's kind of, by saying blasphemy, she's kind of recognizing those traditions and acknowledging them, and sort of this idea of relationships with material things as being impure, but she's kind of saying at the same time, yeah, it's impure, but that's kind of fine actually. Impurity, it's in and of itself, isn't inherently negative. So here is a couple what she then went on to say was that actually what was interesting was that what you got was what she described as these pleasurably tight couplings going on between machines and people, and that actually those distinctions were becoming much more blurry, much more insubstantial. And actually what you find is that that's exactly where we are today. If you look at this picture, that's exactly what's going on. Here is a couple sharing a pleasurably tight coupling. It's the man staring into his phone, ignoring his girlfriend in the background. She's nothing to do with it. It's just him and his phone. And for me, that makes Haraway this remarkably prescient thinker, actually, because she foresaw all of this back in 1983. And what she said then applies now. We're not simply sharing relationships with our machines and our devices. We're actually incorporating them into ourselves. They're not passive objects that we're acting upon. They actually are us. They help us to realize what we are. So my phone isn't simply a platform that helps me communicate and express myself. It actually shapes how I organize my thoughts, the things I need to remember, the things I can happily forget, the memories I store in my head, and the ones I store in the machine. They're actually distributed between the two. So where am I? Am I on my phone or am I in my head? It's kind of difficult to say. So that dualism between mind and matter and between self and object doesn't seem quite so rigid as it might have done to someone like Descartes. So I don't think we need to necessarily talk about technology, although it's very interesting to talk about in terms of technology, to talk about these kinds of identity-forming relationships. Here's a much more mundane example. This is a jar of lemon curd. And we encountered this particular jar of lemon curd during some field work looking into what luxury meant to high net worth individuals. And this particular jar of lemon curd belonged to a high net worth individual from Paris called Hector. and he bought it because it has this sort of slightly salty taste that reminds him of the seaside. And it's salty tasting lemon curd because it comes from the French seaside town of Menton, where it is actually handmade by this husband and wife team. And every year, Bernard goes and visits Menton and buys himself another jar of lemon curd. So what does this jar of lemon curd tell us about Hector and his relationship to luxury? Well, firstly, it's nothing to do with how expensive or exclusive the jar is. This is a man, this picture here, he has crates of £200 champagne in his cupboard. Right, just that one bottle he's holding there is worth 200 quid. He's got like 3 or 4 crates of the stuff. So it's not about that. Instead, it is about something much more personal to Hector, which is his own personal sense of refinement and taste, which to him is the very thing that enabled him to become wealthy in the first place. Because he had that sense, he was able to discern things through his career that made him wealthy. So where this became important for our client is that what we learned here is that luxury need not appeal to the wallet in order to be luxury. Indeed, what this lemon curd story stands for is a much more valuable commodity, items that help high net worth individuals tell themselves the story of their own success. So don't appeal to their wealth, appeal to the sensibilities that help them acquire and keep that wealth in the first place. That's one example. There's another one here I wanted to just quickly share with you before we move on to the next thinker. And this is again taken from the same piece of research. So this is a picture of a chap wandering around outside an expensive house in a not so expensive pair of shorts. And this chap is called Richard. And this is what he generally wears when he is hanging around outside his house. And that is his house, by the way. Now, nothing about those clothes say high net worth. And in this instance, that is precisely the point. On one level, this is just because they are what he would consider to be his normal clothes and the ones he feels most comfortable with. However, these clothes also serve another and probably slightly more interesting purpose. So what Richard likes to do is he likes to wear these clothes almost as a disguise to test out the customer service levels at the various shops and establishments he tends to frequent. So, for example, when he was in the market for a new car, he first visited the showroom in his normal clothes to find that he was actually, as you might expect, largely ignored by the staff because he looked a bit scruffy. He then came back the next day in his wealthy clothes and found that he was suddenly being fawned upon hand and foot. And it's kind of Cinderella, or my boss would say Pretty Woman. He's obviously more into Richard Gere than me. But it's kind of that idea that sits behind it. So what Richard is doing is essentially playing dress up with a basket of selves. And he's using his stuff to manipulate how other people perceive him, while still clinging on to this idea that there is a real Richard who exists separately from that stuff. So for our clients, this kind of gave them this sense of, if they wanted to talk to Richard, that he wants to be recognized as a high net worth individual, even when he's in disguise, in his sort of scruffy clothes. So it's like you need to be able to get the sense of the real Richard that sits beneath all of that, which is quite a tricky thing to do, but it's quite an interesting way to approach servicing high net worth individuals. So here's another angle for thinking about material things, okay? We have a coffee machine on the second floor. It doesn't look like that one. Our one is really temperamental. You sort of go for coffee and you press the button, and instead of giving you coffee, it spits out water, and then you have to change the water, and then you try again and it's run out of beans. You have to put beans in, and you go through this whole sort of process of toing and froing and acquiescing to all its demands before it'll actually give you any coffee. And it's kind of okay because it's nice coffee, but it's this really faffy process. But what happens when I'm engaging in that process is that then I start talking to other people on the second floor where I don't normally otherwise go. And through that, it shapes my relationships with them, and then I get talking with them about other things. We start doing other projects because of that, and actually it shapes the rhythm of my working day. So to ignore that coffee machine would be to ignore a fundamental actor in the system of my working routine, right? So it's not the same idea as the stuff we were dealing with Haraway, right? I'm not saying that the coffee machine is somehow part of myself. It's not like a cyborg relationship, but this material object is still shaping who I am. It's still an actor in my life that has its own demands and in a way its own agency. And this is essentially what my next theorist, this guy called Bruno Latour, was saying when he put forward the idea of actor network theory. And what he said was that to do a proper sociological study, we need to take into account all the actors in the system we're analysing, and that includes the material objects. And again, what's really interesting here is to go back to that idea of profanity and blasphemy we were talking about earlier. There's actually a quote from Latour where he talks about why he's doing this, which sort of fits in. So I'll read you the quote. It says, I have sought to offer humanists a detailed analysis of a technology sufficiently magnificent and spiritual to convince them that the machines by which they are surrounded are cultural artifacts worthy of their attention and respect. So again, Latour is very aware of this idea that you've got the material and the profane and the uninteresting on the one hand, and the spiritual and the mental and the mind on the other. So whereas Haraway wants to kind of embrace that blasphemy and kind of acknowledge it and sort of subvert it, Latour wants to kind of reclaim spirituality, but both in their own ways are wrestling with this notion of the material world as something that's profane. So here is an example of how we have tried to use those kinds of ideas in our research. And this is a workshop in Indonesia. And the task from the client here was that they wanted to find out how mechanics go about recommending oil. So naturally, we asked the mechanics how they recommended oil, and we observed them. But the other thing that we did was to look at how oil lived and moved within the workshop. So how it was displayed, who was allowed to touch it, when people touched it, how they washed it from their hands or smeared it on their trousers. And there's some really interesting stuff came out. Like you found that this engine oil was creeping up into all sorts of funny places, like in the kitchens and in fridges and in little corners and nooks. And it's kind of like it was seeping in to the workshop, and it was really interesting. But it's sort of what we were trying to do there is take on some of those ideas from Latour and try and understand the workshop as a system where the oil was as much an actor as the mechanics themselves. So the final thinker I wanted to talk about, or the final idea I wanted to talk about, was this idea of the habitus. And that comes from this chap here. This chap here being Pierre Bourdieu. And he said something provocative, which I really like, which was this, that the mind is a metaphor of the world of objects. And I like that because what it does is it totally flips on its head all the assumptions of Descartes and Freud and everyone else. And as a repository of meaning, the mind is actually secondary, and it's stuff, the material world, that's primary, because the mind is just a reflection of it. So what you can do then is you can go back to those monks that we talked about earlier, and the whole thing about them arranging fruit around trees and not being allowed to eat it and all that stuff, and realize that those stipulations around the material world that they adhered to, if they didn't have them, they wouldn't know that they were monks, and that their spirituality, far from existing above and beyond the material world, was in fact actually defined by it. Without material, they couldn't have been spiritual. So let's just have a look at that idea in a sort of practical way, right? Here is a sort of habitus tale, if you like. And this is how a lady in Paris discovered herself through her house and used it to tell herself the story of her life. And this was from some research that we were doing into the notion of success in France. And what we found is, if you look closely at this image, if you start in the left-hand corner, is that her life story runs clockwise through the room. So in the left-hand corner, you can see there's a piano. Above the piano are some children's music books, and above that are some other little images from her childhood. So this is her childhood. Then you move across, unfortunately it's under the blue square, but you can kind of see a plant. There's a painting there that she bought as a student. And it was the first thing she bought with her own money, and it symbolises her independence when she first left the nest, as it were. And then my favourite bit is right in the middle, just above the TV. You can just about make out there's an Air France poster there, and there's this big white aeroplane flying above these black elephants in Africa. And it's in the middle of her room because this is the pivotal point in her life, because she met her husband in Africa. And everything on the left is her life before that, and everything on the right is her life after that. So when you look on the right, you can see that it's sort of teeming with life, teeming with stuff. There's all sorts of little statuettes from little trips she's done with her family. There's pictures of her kids. There's pictures that her kids have done for her. And I think probably a fair amount of that is quite deliberate. Probably also there's quite a lot of stuff going on there that's unconscious. But what's so interesting is that actually the story of her life is being told through her stuff. And kind of to tie that back to a sort of more client-friendly thing, I guess what came out here was just how highly she valued her ability to collect and curate objects. Obviously, the other thing that room very much resembled, if you've ever been to the Pitt Rivers Museum or somewhere like that, is one of those real old school sort of Victoriana sort of museums in the original sense of the word, like those sort of boxes of curiosity, right? So this is her curated space, and her ability to collect and curate objects was really valuable to her sense of self. And again, it's this sort of idea of her own personal refinement and taste, and her ability to spot the value in things that no one else is able to see, which you can see her here in this picture of her in Paris, indulging in her other favourite pastime, which is trawling the market stalls, again, to find things of value that no one else can see and bring them back to her home and sort of reassemble them in new ways. And again, that's actually the story of her career. And it's the thing that makes her feel like a successful business lady, that discerning eye that she has. So I think that was something really quite interesting. So I'm going to end on the same challenge that I ended the conference with, because I haven't solved any of these questions yet. It kind of takes for granted with the idea that you're now on board with material culture, which you may or may not be. But the points being, the first one, if knowledge doesn't live exclusively in people's heads, then how do we get at it? So this is really sort of a question of how do you analyse material culture. So if there's a world of material things out there with meaning invested in them, how do we get at it? I mean, one obvious solution is semiotics, right? That's something that's been knocking around for a fair while now, and that is explicitly about looking at certainly packaging to try and extrapolate cultural meaning. But then semiotics doesn't really have that relational element, right? So objects are symbols, they carry meaning, but one of the things I think we're trying to say here is that objects are also actually active in the way meaning is produced as well. They're relational. They're not just something that has meaning imposed on them. They are imposing meaning on us in turn. So do we refine semiotics to take into account, or do we look at other theories and other ideas to try and get at that stuff? The next one, which is one that I'm personally very interested in, is what about bodies, right? I mentioned bodies earlier on in the research, in this presentation, as something that sort of gets lumped with sort of the profane material world, right? That bit with cogito ergo sum, the body gets kind of chucked on the waste bin as well, and it's kind of like this idea that they're not worthy of consideration, but actually that bodies do contain knowledge. If you think of ballet dancers, right, and if you ask them to describe how they dance, they're not going to be able to do it, because all that knowledge isn't in their heads, it's in their bodies. And it would be great to see a way we kind of account for that embodied knowledge and think of the body as something more than just a vehicle for propelling the mind around. And that's an interesting challenge I'd love to get more into. And the last one is, how do you evidence the unspoken? So if we're going beyond language, how do we actually show unspoken stuff? If we're not relying on quotes from people, how do we show this stuff and prove that it exists to our clients? And actually, I think this is probably the potentially the easiest one of these, because we have film and we have photography, and through that you can certainly get a lot of behavioural stuff. You can sort of start looking at how people are moving. You can start photographing rooms in the way that I've done in this presentation and talk in that way. But I think that there's a step beyond that as well, because an image is very much open to manipulation. It's very much open to misinterpretation. So how do you start sort of locking down meaning in a slightly more rigorous way? And those are kind of my three big questions. Hopefully you have other questions too. It's got you thinking in different ways. I'd love to hear what they are. I don't know if anyone's posted any or not. If you haven't, you still can. But otherwise, that is my presentation. And I'll just say thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. That was absolutely fascinating. And as Jim says, yes, please do post your questions, and he'll respond within a day or two to them as they come in. There'll also be a copy of this webinar going up on the AQR website. It'll probably be there in a couple of weeks or so. So please have a look if you want to see it again, or tell your friends and they can look at it. Before I go, a couple of bits of parish news. The first is that the Young Unfocused group is running the AQR again quite soon. So if you've got under 7 years experience, then please rock up to that. It's at the Warwick pub in Leicester Square on 19th of November at 6:30. It's sponsored by Lichtleiter Associates, forgive me if I've said that incorrectly, and by Criteria Fieldwork. Both of them deserve your acclaim, because if you're going along, you'll notice they're the ones that will be paying for the booze. So it's well worth attending, and it'll be good fun. 6 people to a team, but you can join teams. You don't have to go with 6. You can join teams there and then. And the next thing is there's a Spark event coming up, and that's on the 1st of December, 7 o'clock till 9 o'clock at the Engine Rooms. Mary Coyne and Kat Slater are running that, and it's called Stop, Breathe and Be. So there's always lots going on at the AQR. Please have a look at the website. You'll see what's there. Thank you once again to Jim, and thank you to all of you for attending. See you at the next one. Bye now.